When I was a kid, my dad used to tell me about like these people who lived in the hills of New Jersey. So there's like this area called the Ramapo Mountains in New Jersey.
Nice. Okay.
And there were supposedly these people who lived there who were descended of Hessian soldiers, which are like, I don't know how. Do you guys learn much about like the American Revolution there? I feel like that would be like a footnote.
Fuck all.
I figured probably not. Hessian soldiers were basically Germans who fought on the side of Britain during the American Revolution, and this is what in the Tim Burton version of Sleepy Hollow.
That
That's
was my immediate connection. They described him as the Hessian.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what that
Hmm.
refers to. So supposedly, what my dad told me about these people were that they were descended of Hessian soldiers who had like deserted the revolution and like fucked off to live in the hills of New Jersey, I guess, because there is
Mm.
a lot of Revolutionary War stuff in this general vicinity.
Hmm.
And they just wanted to be left alone up there. Uh, but they, I guess, became increasingly violent about being left alone. And
Mm.
so it was kind of this unspoken thing with people surrounding it and with the police and, whatnot, that you just kind of left the people living up in the Ramapo Mountains alone. They didn't want anything to do with us. We didn't want anything to
Fine.
do with them. They
Mm.
go live up there. According to my dad, he said that, every now and again they'd get some sort of like gung ho new police chief who would be like, I'm going to rein in those lawless people in the mountains. And
Time's up.
Yep, and then would send someone up, some poor patrolman up into the mountains who inevitably would never return again. And in fact, one of the stories my father told me, just like really, really terrible thing to tell a kid, but was that once a police officer was sent up there, by an overzealous police chief to try to rein them in. And a few days later, his body was found sort of strung up and gutted on like some form of
Oh
post,
yeah.
yeah, as a warning to
Yep.
people, to say, hey, don't screw with us.
Yep.
Now these people, as I got older, I was like, I want to know, like, was this just like a thing that my dad made up to scare me, or like, I don't know,
Mm.
maybe that his dad told him to scare him? Like, where did this sort of come from? So I had looked up who, I was like, Mawa, New Jersey, like hill people, or they, like murdered cop, like any number of things like this. And there are a group of people who live in the Ramapo Mountains here, um, who have all kinds of folklore about them. And so these people, um, let me look here real quick. So I guess a literary magazine called Appleton's Journal in 1872 described the people living up there as fugitive slaves who buried themselves deep in the gorges of the mountain and reared children wild and more savage than themselves. Uh,
Fantastic.
and then Weird New Jersey, which is like a publication in New Jersey that's
Mm.
pretty famous, and they've actually put out like books of things from other states and whatnot as well. So you can get like Weird California, Weird Indiana, things like that. They describe the origins of this group of people thusly: allegedly comprised of a mongrel hybrid of renegade Indians, escaped slaves, Hessian mercenary deserters, and West Indian prostitutes imported to New York City for British soldiers during the Revolution. And these people have come to be known as the Jackson Whites. And Jackson, oh, go ahead.
I know about the Jackson
You
Whites.
do not. Shut up.
Fucking yes, I do. And
Where do you?
after you're done, I'll tell you from where.
Okay.
Mm-mm-mm.
Okay, fine.
Yes.
But the Jackson Whites is essentially a slur, so I'm not actually going to use
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
term
Of course.
anymore.
Just I'm sure they wouldn't respond well to being called mongrels either. That's
No,
a fucking
none of
yeah.
that description is
Whoa.
something that
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
Jackson Whites would like to be called.
Mm-hmm.
What they call themselves are the Ramapo Indians. And
Fair enough.
as you might have guessed by now, or might know from wherever you know them from before this, being America, the nasty rumors about them is actually good old fashioned racism and classism.
What else?
Yeah, imagine that. There was never any police officer strung up and eviscerated on a post. All of this
Ah,
kinds of stuff never happened. The Ramapos are basically like stories people have made up about us make absolutely no sense. Like,
mm,
okay, we're descendant of prostitutes. Why would sex workers walk 30 miles outside of New York City, away
yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
people, to a
So,
place that's sparsely populated and full of impoverished folk?
mm,
Doesn't super make sense right there.
no, it doesn't.
And the runaway slave thing, the Ramapos point out that like when white people look at this, they just immediately think black. These people would be descended of black people, and they're like, no, the Indians were enslaved too. The British people took or the colonists took Indians as slaves as
Mm,
well. So when we're talking about
mm,
runaway slaves, we're not talking about black people here. We're talking about Native Americans who were
yeah,
taken as slaves as the time as well.
yeah,
And this Hessian soldier thing and whatnot. Basically, they're kind of looking at the sort of like Dutch-ish last names that people have there, like de Groot and whatnot.
yeah, yeah.
And they're like, yeah, so clearly they were mixed with someone, as opposed to what happens with slavery. You end up with the last name of the master. So these
Mm.
people are actually Native Americans that have been, uh, denied their ethnicity. And our Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, doesn't recognize them as a tribe or anything like that.
But they're still out there. Yes, they
They're
still
still
exist.
out there, and shows that there's, only, I mean, I think there's like maybe 1,000 of them total.
Mm.
But still, like shows and movies have been made about them, like the movie Out of the Furnace, which they actually a group of Ramapos sued Relativity Media over their depiction in Out of the Furnace, which Relativity Media said the film is not based on one person or group and is entirely fictional.
Mm.
But 9 members of the group, 8 of whom have the surname de Groot, which was the same as the lead character, pointed out that it was about a bunch of inbreds living in the Ramapo Mountains who are lawless, drug addicted, impoverished, and violent.
Seems a little
Yeah, it's a weird
on the
coincidence
nose.
there,
I don't
Relativity
know.
Media.
Eh.
Very weird coincidence. Also, there was a Ford plant in the Ramapo Mountains that caused toxicity in the water and soil that led to illnesses and birth defects among the Ramapo people. Now, when the media got a hold of this narrative, what do you suppose they blamed these birth defects on, do you think?
I'm gonna say inbreeding.
Inbreeding, right?
Did I get it right? Yay.
Absolutely. So it wasn't that big corporations were taking advantage of these people and poisoning them, but in fact,
Mm.
that they had inbred themselves into these monsters.
Mutants. Yeah,
The
yeah.
soil contamination also led to squirrels in the area being contaminated, and squirrels are a major food source for the Ramapos. So, of
Oh
course,
no.
people like David Letterman picked it up and turned it into a big Hicks eating squirrels joke. Again, instead of a story about a group of people being poisoned by a corporation. So I grew
Mm.
up on this, story of these like mercenary people who were like murdering folks in crazy ways coming up into the hills and whatnot. And the thing I've learned now,
Propagated
Mark, is
by
that
your dad.
by my dad, who was, my dad was maybe this is why this doesn't come from my mother, the black woman from New Jersey.
Yeah, yeah,
My
yeah.
dad, who
Sure,
was a
sure, sure.
white guy from New Jersey, had
Yep.
learned, all of these kinds of stories that now I'm like, oh, dad, you were passing down a racism is what you were doing.
Yep.
Oh, but yeah, nobody has been eviscerated by the Ramapo people.
As an aside,
Yeah, please.
I absolutely love how. Well, put it like this, right? This weekend, I've spent some time wandering in the mountains,
Mm,
in the border between Wales and England, right? Herefordshire, just a huge, beautiful, fucking achingly gorgeous landscape.
mm.
And yet nowhere near big or remote enough to fucking shelter a fucking
Yeah, a
people,
whole community of people.
an entire community of people from civilization. Totally.
Yeah.
I love and am simultaneously awed
Yeah.
and bewildered by the fucking scale of a country that is
Yeah.
still in 2021 vast enough in parts to completely house and shelter a community away from the surrounding civilization by their own choice.
Yeah, it is wild. In fact, there was something the other day that happened in the UK, and I, for whatever reason, was looking up sort of like the scale
Yeah, yeah,
of like England specifically
yeah,
to like America, and just
yeah.
thinking about like how small that space is compared
Minute.
to, and
Yeah.
I was looking at population too, because I figured out the entire population of England is like the population of like California and New York. So
Yeah.
two states is an
Yep.
entire country. So it is really crazy. I mean, this isn't that far from here. The Ramapo Mountains, this is like 15, 20 miles from where I am. Bergen County is the
Mm,
next county over. And it's, yeah, there's just this, and this, the space they take up spans New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So there's just like this stretch of
mm.
wilderness full of these people that really don't, like by choice, they don't interact with the rest of us. And you can see why. I mean, people are terrible about them. There was an incident a few years ago where one of them was killed by cops. And it
Yeah.
was like, at first, people were very sympathetic because they just saw it as like cops killed a person over riding their ATV. And then as
Mm.
soon as it was revealed that it was one of the Ramapos, like the conversation completely
Eh.
turned, and everyone was just like, "Oh God, thank goodness we're getting rid of those
One
inbred
less.
assholes
Yeah,
who
yeah, 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 yeah.
give ATVs a bad name and yada yada yada." And it's bonkers. So yeah,
Mm.
that's a little bit of local Jersey lore. But
Thank
how do
you.
you know about the Jackson Whites?
So there's a British metal band called the Wild Hearts, right?
Okay.
Who've been around fucking hell, man. The Wild Hearts are one of those bands who came out of the 90s and have just fucking stuck around, right? Through various guises, various incarnations. And one of their recent albums called Chutzpah from like maybe 5, 6 years ago has a track on it called The Jackson Whites. And the chorus goes, I want to be alone just like the Jackson Whites. And
Okay, I'm only going to give partial credit for knowing what I was talking about, because that
and
is,
yeah, but I then went on to have a bit of a tippity
oh,
tap and
okay.
have a look and look them up.
What does that mean?
Um,
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
yeah,
Fair enough.
and for what it's worth, the song's fucking brilliant.
Oh, well,
And
but it's
I,
also
I
kind of like
shall,
calling to those people, it's like calling your song
yeah,
the N word, but
yes.
nonetheless.
I heard it, if that helps.
What'd you say?
I doubt they've heard it, if that helps.
It's a really good point. So, hey, I tip my hat and my drink to the Ramapos. Fight on.
Same.
Fight
Yep.
on.
Yep. You're fine by us, lads.